Good day, everyone, and welcome to Experience Day. My name is Mona Valdez, Assistant Director of Outreach and Events. I'm so glad you'll be able to spend part of your day with us. In a little while, you have an opportunity to hear from our featured speaker, Dr. Peter Rojcewicz, Pacifica's Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs. After Dr. Rojcewicz speaks on existential intimacy of learning, he can answer some of your questions. But now, I'd like to introduce Jessica Rubenstein, Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination, who will share a little more what the day will entail. She'll also introduce you to the institution's president, Dr. Joseph Cambray, to welcome you all today.
Thank you, Mona. And again, thank you all for being here. My name is Jessica Rubenstein, and I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. As Mona said, we'll first be given a welcome by Dr. Joseph Cambray, President and CEO of Pacifica Graduate Institute, followed by our featured presentation by Dr. Peter Rojcewicz, Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Pacifica. There is also a free application link on the landing page, and I'm going to show you that right now. So here you can see our landing page. For our general website. And here are our admissions advisor contact information. So if you're interested in a specific program, you can feel free to give them a call or email at any time. And again, here are some further resources. And I'd also like to share our guides and reading lists down below. Here are reading lists for all of our programs. These are suggested reading lists to get you more engaged with some of the academic content. And we have our financial aid guide, Pacifica guidebook, and more. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the advisors or admissions@pacifica.edu. I'm going to show you one more time where the advisor contact information is. And let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph Cambray, President and CEO.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome to everyone. I'm so glad to have you with us, even in this remote method. What I'd like to talk just for a few moments with you about is why Pacifica now. The choice of a graduate education, of course, is a major life decision. And this is a particular moment for our culture, for our entire society, for education, and for Pacifica Graduate Institute. We are all emerging from the pandemic of the last we've been closed for 15 months now in doing only remote education. It's been a tremendous challenge, but also an enormous learning experience for us. We've refined our skills, we've expanded our online presence and all of our capacities. And we recognize that this is education for the future. Not that it's going to be fully remote, but that there will be synchronous and asynchronous pieces that will be part of remote learning to integrate with the rest of in-person classes. We're not going to go back to a simple pre-COVID-19 normal. I think that world is passing. What the new normal is evolving, and we're very much interested in making sure that education meets the needs of that transformation. For example, one of the things that's happened in this period is the acceptance of telehealth. That prior to the pandemic, insurance companies would not reimburse providers for services, especially mental health services that were done over the internet. That has changed. That now is being allowed in almost every state, and we expect that that's probably going to endure into the future. In addition, as we all know, and very sadly, there's a huge mental health crisis that's already here in terms of the impact of these 15, 16 months of loss and suffering and sort of social distance and alienation. And so this whole question of reopening our society, Pacific is very much a part of that. We're right now planning our reopening, and we will do that in the next year. The exact date we're working on right now, but we will announce that shortly. But we will see, those of you who want to be here, we'll see you next year on campus. So our approach to learning is communal and holistic and systemic. We look at the roots of what our culture is struggling to recognize and acknowledge. For example, climate change, the global nature of viral pandemics, and those two, by the way, are closely linked, the origins of racism, recognizing that the archetypal quality of the moment, that's what we have an eye towards, providing an education that will sustain you through your career and your whole life, providing you tools of critical embodied thinking together with accessing and applying the creative imagination. It's also a time, as I mentioned, of collective mourning, a time to reflect on our losses that are still going on. We're over now 600,000 people who have died in the US alone. We've had a virtual grieving tree project that's focused around a mulberry tree that we have on our Lambert campus. This was done through the initiative of one of our current Asian doctoral students, and it's going to be incorporated into a Fulbright fellowship that person is doing. So it's one of the kinds of efforts. This year has also been an important time to acknowledge systemic racism in our culture, including in our educational system. And Pacifica has a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force, as well as a council that's helping us find our way and articulate the pathways we need to discover to really embrace the transformation into an anti-racist society. And just yesterday, we celebrate President Biden signed Juneteenth into law as a federal holiday. Through our community outreach, just this week, we were chosen to host a visit of a totem pole carved in honor of Deb Haaland, the appointed Secretary of the Interior for President Biden. Ms. Haaland is the first Native American to serve on a president's cabinet. We were joined by some Chumash elders for a ceremony as our campuses are situated on the traditional territories of the Chumash and Gabrielino Tsonga peoples, the first inhabitants of the Channel Islands and Santa Monica Mountains, to whom we pay our deep respect. The totem pole was created by the House of Tears carvers from the Lumi Indian Nation in Washington State, and will have a select number of stops before it will be delivered to President Biden. The holistic approach we foster here at Pacifica is profoundly relational. We attend to the deep interconnectedness of all things, including in the psyche. And we see the psyche as a profoundly ecological entity, and that's our perspective, an ecological perspective. For example, my own research is on rhizomatic structures that are being identified in nature, from neural nets in brains to root systems in forests to the very fabric of the universe. We are beginning to discover the levels of interconnectedness that have not been there before. And that is something that is going to transform education in the 21st century. It will take all of the paradigms we've been working with and really challenge them in some very profound ways. But rather than go on at length about this, I'm going to move now to our Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Peter Rojcewicz. He's had an illustrious career for many years in higher education. And today he'll help us see beyond our cultural fixation on STEM education and revaluing a more complex, holistic way of knowing that really speaks to the heart of the Pacifica experience. So Dr. Rojcewicz, please, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, President Cambray. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people from across the country and across the world, so it's a pleasure to have you join us here for this Pacifica Experience Day. Again, my name is Peter Rojcewicz, and I'm the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Pacifica. I first want to acknowledge my colleague Santos, who will be behind the scenes and managing some slides for me. So thank you, Santos, for your help this morning. So I just want to touch base with the topic and the title. So you see it there, Existential Intimacy of Learning, a noetic turn from STEM. So let's begin. You, like many people, are thinking about graduate and professional education as a means to prepare yourselves to navigate this indeterminate reality of our present life. Every sector of society faces great change due to the pandemic, globalization, political divisions, racism, climate change, and existential challenges to authority and knowledge, democracy, and the planet itself. So the question is, what forms should higher education take in order to prepare people to be equal to the increasing complexity of our times? Grasping the way the world works, understanding the way the world works has long been a goal sought by higher education. But today, this question about how the world works is highly problematized, and the traditional certainties and values of the academy are hotly contested. Universities today face pressure to justify their relevance by trying to address the warp and woof of our times: paradox, chaos, liminality, asymmetry, emergence, synchronicity. Questions are raised: who can we trust to be definitive knowledge agents in such a world? Higher education faces a daunting task of explaining a world of increasing complex change, even as the world continues to change. Dean Neubauer argued that education today at all levels must become, in creative and novel ways, first, a theorizing activity, and second, a pervasive inquiry into the nature, order, and the way of things. We must shift our focus away from simply knowing that things happen to knowing how they happen. In this world, it's necessary that transdisciplinarity become the currency of the day to determine determine relevant information and to use it effectively and ethically. Since social and cultural, political, and environmental changes appear to operate within an unpredictable logic of complexity theory, Neubauer sees that the cognitive skills of flexibility, unlearning, improvisation, and response ableness, all which are transdisciplinary skills, are more important today, he says, than formal, codified, structured, and explicit knowledge. Are universities today organized to empower people to effectively navigate a world of rapid, complex change and indeterminacy? And as you are considering graduate education, that question must be on your mind. So today, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics permeate the academy, and they value technical training over broad-based learning. While STEM has its scientific and technological literacy, providing us certain skills essential for employment, STEM's tech-savvy and quantitative focus undervalues the imagination. It separates perception from cognition. It narrows intuitive awareness and enhances the domination and control over nature. STEM's grand narratives encourage universal generalizations and unrealistic categories and taxonomies. The natural sciences, like STEM in general, lies outside of the domain of values and outside of ethics. So STEM can tell us, for example, how to make a bomb, but it can't tell us whether we should do it or not do it, or why. That's not its domain. STEM, however, is the curriculum of choice of mainstream calculative society. STEM enshrines logic and calculation. It idolizes objectivity. It privileges the exterior surfaces of things over the interior depths of things. And its dominant epistemology, a way of knowing, is scientific materialism and positivism. So it projects a flatland view of reality without an interior. And we see STEM starting so very early in schools. What begins in our elementary and middle schools on a personal level as the instrumentation of reason narrows and routinizes of thinking. It then ends up on the socio-cultural level as the mechanization of life. And it shackles our cognitive freedom. So higher education is at a crossroad. Okay? We see the quote in front by Martin Gregorian, who was a former provost at University of Pennsylvania. And he says, higher education must raise the important issues and guide students in synthesizing responses, if not answers. Failing to do this is a missed opportunity of staggering dimensions. For history shows that humanity has a craving for wholeness. So higher education is at a crossroads, and as Dr. Gregorian has pointed out, we witness a serious imbalance in the academy that is injurious to one's wholeness, to one's integral humanity. And so in this presentation, as in my scholarship, I stand firmly and unapologetically upon the premise that human wholeness is health and its division is illness. And so therefore I see currently in higher education an illness onto learning, if you will, that rather than educating an all-sided mind, our universities with the privileging of STEM targets a narrow band of skills and competencies that are almost exclusively suited for employment. So higher education is at a decisive crossroad during a time as you look for what institutions are appropriate for your learning, right? Higher education must decide whether it's going to continue to support a narrow piecemeal growth over human wholeness. And the analytical STEM disciplines of higher education, with their codified procedures, do not by themselves address full human development. STEM knowledge is important, of course, important as far as it goes, but by itself, it leads to a narrow view of knowledge, views life as wholly rational, wholly controllable and objective, and separates us from our integral humanity. So what's to be done? At Pacifica, we see a different perspective. We operate on a pluralistic conception of what constitutes intelligent thought and behavior that joins analytical and calculative reason with hands-on engagement with the humanities and art making to derive a more accurate model of mind and reality. So my critical educational agenda that I present here today has as its goal an intimacy of learning between knowledge and a zest for life that unites the traditional knowledge bases and disciplines with what is emergent as part of a timely, imaginative reconsideration of learning. And to that end, Noetic Education is my theorizing activity and pervasive inquiry and my constructive postmodern critique of higher education's hyper-rational calculative approaches to learning. So what is Noetic Education? Noetic comes from the Greek word nous, meaning all-encompassing ways of knowing. Noetic education values a wide repertoire of modalities, including the imaginal, the aesthetic, and the transcendent. The purpose of Noetic education is to support the unification of human faculties with perception of the mind-body, its vision of interdependence of the mind, of the body, of the spirit, and of a union of humanity with Earth, emphasizes, as President Cambray said, a holistic, cooperative, and relational approach, and it uses pluralistic ways of learning that include the rational and intuitive, the sonic, the bodily kinesthetic, the inter and intrapersonal, tactile and visual ways of knowing. Noetic education is a theory and an inquiry and an approach that seeks to empower people in a world where they frequently feel overwhelmed and acted upon by overpowering and indeterminate forces. It's a theory and a practice of liberation from the shackles on human cognitive freedom, a liberation from repressive cognitive constraints which are embedded in different conventional curriculum. My holistic theory and practice of Noetic education does not propose, this should be stressed, does not propose that we abandon the fundamental human project to grasp the world in rational terms. But I do propose that we refine that project of rational and calculative inquiry by adding subjective, indigenous, and tacit knowledge to achieve a larger intersensory literacy and intellectual pluralism that makes available to the mind-body more, not less, than instrumental reason, while at the same time recognizing the role of reason in the process of achieving personal transformation and socially responsible acts. Higher education in general needs to move towards fostering human wholeness through definitions that are larger. To foster wholeness, our definitions of being smart, of being intelligent, must move beyond a strict definition of reason as but a tool of quantitative efficiency, and beyond or expand our definition of learning only in terms of what can be assessed by strict quantification. Pacifica moves beyond those narrow definitions of reason and learning. It moves towards a intimate knowing that heals the splits and the divisions between our objective and subjective knowledge, our interior and exterior lives. Noetic education is intersensory thinking and living embodied thought, not accomplished with the brain, but in and through the entire mind body and leading to a whole intelligence. So I want to speak for a moment about noetic literacy. Intersensory thinking that we're talking about here leads to a kind of intimate knowledge, the union of subject and object. The term cognoscere or co-knowing means communion with materials. It means a unity with what your study objects that allows one to discern and penetrate both objective and subjective realities. So this intimate knowledge is complementary to what happens in STEM, signified knowledge, where signs represent something out there, and there's a separation between the knower and the known. So here is a few indications of what you might intuit or feel as intimate knowing from Walt Whitman, Plotinus, and Wallace Stevens. There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became, and that object became part of him. Plotinus, no eye ever saw the sun without becoming sun-like, nor can a soul see beauty without becoming beautiful. Wallace Stevens, one must have a mind of winter. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost of the boughs of the pine tree crusted with snow. We often hear that, inside of the life of children, their life is not fully internalized as subjects for several years. And for them, the world has not yet fully externalized as objects. And when they play, they move within the interior of the world, and their self is an object in that world, and they move back and forth. So this brings up the idea of this intimacy, this knowledge of intimacy with noetic literacy. So noetic literacy through the arts, there was a quote years ago, I remember from Herbert Reed in a book called Education Through Art. And he said that the aim of education is the creation of artists. And what he meant by that, not only painters and dancers and poets and filmmakers, but also people who are efficient in various ways of knowing and modes of expression. That is noetic education. And he mentions the arts, right? Why noetic literacy through the arts? In our engaged humanities and the creative life degree program, there is hands-on making with the arts and studying of the arts. Why the arts? There is something inherent in the images of each language of the art, the language of music and dance and poetry. There's something inherent in the languages of the arts that prepares the mind for very sophisticated cognitive activities, both conceptual and perceptual. Images. Image making is the mind's most fundamental means of knowing. No cognitive operation is more central to consciousness. New learning results when lived experiences provide, confirm, or modify images of oneself and the world. Images are not simply metaphors for ideas. but images relate to how people acquire, organize, retrieve, and use information. And think, for example, how true this is. When you read a document, if it doesn't raise an image in your mind, what you read has no impact on you. You are lost. So this is what we mean by noetic literacy. It is a literacy of literacies. It constitutes a broader, more inclusive conception of reading or literacy through writing or speaking or listening or even calculating in numbers, or broader literacy than the use of native or foreign tongues. It is the ability to read, if you will, or interpret or communicate images, symbols, signs, representations, to read behaviors, to read the images of gestures and sounds, to read the images generated through intonations, to read the images generated by the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist. This is noetic literacy. It means reading images across a spectrum that is intellectual, that is artistic, that is cultural, that is ecological, and all of those domains. This is a power to understand and make sense of a world that is changing and radically indeterminate. It means it's the capacity, this literacy is the capacity to understand the signals of intelligence embedded in play, children's play, adult play, in art, in stories, in myths, in mathematics, right? It's the signals of intelligence in science and engineering and architecture and design, all of that. It's an appreciation of life through all the mediums through which meaning is expressed. Creative and individual people in all fields demonstrate a broad-based literacy beyond written language and numbers that joins discursive and non-discursive knowledge, as well as abstract and embodied learning. So where can we find strong examples of noetic literacy? History points out that accomplished scientists, like artists everywhere, note the importance of imagery in their most significant work. Jerome Friedman, for example, knew that scientific reasoning is constructed with movable images, just as poetry is. A vision of molecules forming the archetypal image of the Ouroboros led to Friedrich von Kuckel's discovery of the 6-carbon benzene ring. And by imagining himself moving with a beam of light at 186,000 miles per second, Albert Einstein acknowledged the key role that kinesthetic and visual images played in his Gedanken thought experiment. So whether we look to art or science, it is clear that broad-based knowledge rests upon the interrelationships between distinct clusters of multi-sensory images in the mind. Creative artists and scientists alike integrate intuition and unconscious processes with mental skills, which include accurate observation. Artists and scientists together are capable of spatial and kinesthetic thought, identification of key parts of complex wholes, and the recognition or invention of patterns governing complex systems. So the most creative scientists are very much like artists in that respect. When STEM-based elements fuse or integrate with the arts and humanities through complex creative work in the arts, an existential intimacy of learning with their all-sided humanity takes place. And that's the focus of today's presentation, an existential intimacy of learning with one's all-sided humanity. So let me talk now about how that is achieved, by what faculty. What is the cognitive imagination? Cognitive imagination, or you might call it intuitive intelligence. In depth psychology, it's often described as the innate faculty of the psyche. but I see it as a principal key of unlocking a door to a new order of things. Is the essential tool, the essential means of connection and belonging and meaning, as important to artists as to scientists or any other field in our society. It is the premier human faculty. I mean, how many times have you heard people dismiss the imagination? But it is the premier human faculty that draws upon our full endowment, our full complements of human abilities. It is a basis of thinking in general. And it is applicable to all fashion of work, all careers. The cognitive faculty of the imagination is also the faculty of visionary perception and the creative synthesis that gives rise to a unique organization of life. So you have in front of you now a slide by Rudolf Arnheim, and it reads, by cognitive, I mean all the mental operations involved in receiving, storing, and processing information, sensory perception, memory, thinking, learning. This use of the term conflicts with one which many psychologists are accustomed and which excludes the activity of the senses from cognition. Similarly, I see no way of withholding the name thinking from what goes on in perception. No thought processes seem to exist that cannot be found to operate in perception. Visual perception is visual thinking. So the cognitive imagination is the hallmark of a fluid, complex intelligence. It is essential for living in our traumatized world. It allows for us to be adaptive, responsive, pluralistic, and transdisciplinary. Let us pause for a moment and consider some cross-cultural examples of noetic literacy, of intersensory learning through the cognitive imagination. As a cultural anthropologist and a folklorist, we see that in African languages and in many other cultures that are based on oral rather than written traditions, there is no word that precisely corresponds to the English word music. One significant African concept relative to the concept of music comes from the Bantu peoples. And the word, Swahili word is ngoma. And ngoma is a word meaning drum, dance, festivity. Now, I didn't say that it means drum or dance or festivity, but drum, dance, festivity. Words having something to do with, these words that have something to do with music, right? Ngoma does, but it's related to other things as well. So ngoma, the word means to point out that it's impossible to isolate music from other elements. And perhaps the word that gives full understanding of that also comes from the Bantu peoples, and the word is sikia. And it is the word for integrated sensation. And so sikia discloses the full meaning of ngoma. Sikia means sensing with one's whole being. What a perfect example or definition of noetic literacy. Sensing with one whole being that leads to understanding. And among the Bantu, the visual and the sonic, right? The visual, sonic, musical, and the kinesthetic perception equals visual, sonic, and kinesthetic thinking. Music and dance and humanity in the world form an organic whole. There is no word for listening and hearing because it doesn't capture the integrated sensing that comes from music, dance, and humanity and the world being one. Sikia, a word that suggests that one sees, listens, moves, and dances to music simultaneously. and therefore there can be no meaning divorced from participation. When one studies ethnographically dance and drumming and music in many countries, countries and communities in Africa, you see that it's that drumming presupposes music, music presupposes dance, and they are all part of defining what it means to be a member of that community. In the Cameroon, for example, there is one word for sing and dance. In Nigeria, song, dance, play are all together as a unity. In the Pacific, the Polynesian Islands, the same fundamental insight. And this is common to all oral cultures. In Samoa, the notion of pesa, which is song, is combined with siva or dance. And there's an solubly, they're bound together. So what's common to all oral cultures everywhere is that singing provokes bodily movement, and it cannot be separated. And therefore, in these activities of noetic literacy, it naturally creates a greater unity. It brings together what we would call the divisions that come, say, from STEM education, which develops and separates out your intuition from your calculative mentality. The cognitive imagination should not be considered something strange or something otherworldly or in a culture far away from us. The cognitive imagination is not exotic, it is not occult, it is part of our unique endowment of what it means to be human. And it enables us to make strategic decisions and realize goals and situations lacking a prescribed answer or response, which is very much the world today. And when you can think with integrated sensing, you are able to get a better reading on the complex moments that we are in, which often defy a strict quantitative or rational approach. Unlike with STEM skills, we continuously discover in our life that our understanding is facilitated by cognitive processes that are mysterious to us as to how they actually function. We often feel, don't we, a certain gut feeling or intuitive intelligence that lead us to understandings without knowing how to explain them, right? Our expertise, our capacity is more intuitive than was once thought by cognitive psychologists. And faced with subtle, complex, and mysterious tasks of facing the world and knowing how it works and being equal to the challenges, right, where the answers and solutions are unknown to us, people often feel and intuit their way through to innovation, feel and intuit their way onward to solutions. So the cognitive imagination is a mysterious kind of cognitive faculty, which is as much rational as it is intersensory. Michael Polanyi used the term tacit knowing to indicate its unconscious source. Tacit knowing, very much akin to what we're talking about with the cognitive imagination. So every person possesses a cognitive power or intuitive intelligence that allows them to deal with everyday challenges of our lives. But it must be brought forward. It must be part of our curriculum, whether academic or that of our everyday life. It is essential during times of turbulent change and the dissolution of traditional values, and in a time that we're contesting the certainty of facts and knowledge. Jerome Bruner, a Harvard cognitive psychologist, used the word today, people, when they're most creative, perthink. What he meant by perthink, people perceive, feel, and think simultaneously, very much like the Bantu concept of Sakia. So the cognitive imaginations I'm defining is a challenge to the conventional Enlightenment idea that intelligence is a single generative cognitive function. The cognitive imagination is part of a noetic education challenges the literal mind, challenges the reductionist mind, challenges the routinized mind, all of which is the uninspired mind. And the uninspired mind can never be a rigorous mind suitable for graduate education. The uninspired mind is rigor mortis of the mind. So let me talk about literacies of wisdom. Literacies of wisdom. Wisdom is a funny term because it's not often used in higher education. Talk about knowledge or information or data. But let's talk about wisdom that comes from intersensory understanding of noetic literacies. So we're talking about noetic education as a form of wisdom beyond simple knowing facts. And it's a wisdom whose concepts and whose metaphors include, but move beyond the observing eye, toward the accurate touch, toward the perceptive tongue, toward the discriminating nose and the differentiating ear and the thinking heart. Santos, next slide, please. I'm sorry, if you go back, I'm sorry. There's it. So there's a quote here in front of us by from a book called Memory of the Hand, Making Sense of Art Through Touch. And she says, Rosalind Driscoll says, touch is the most encompassing of the senses. The organ of touch is the entire skin, the largest organ in the body, with neural pathways deep into the interior and directly to the brain. Skin and brain develop from the same primordial cells in the embryo, suggesting that intelligence is intertwined with tactile experience. Touching is the intelligence of the body at work. So the true wisdom that we're talking about, that the curricula at Pacifica Graduate Institute strives for, is a wisdom resulting from the fluency in a language of philosophy. And the language of philosophy means that our curriculum will bring to you concepts and rational summations. But it's also, this true wisdom is part of the language of the body, of images that register multiplicities and valences, right? These images witness human experience and the difficulty, they witness the difficulty to analyze and predict and to control human experience. The project of Noetic Education is an open critique of the sickly breach in human wholeness between our sensory perceptions and our cognitive knowledge that is prevalent throughout much of higher education. So this comes now to two statements by C.G. Jung. One little editorial comment. C.G. Jung's official name was something that he very much wanted to have as C.G. Jung, not as Carl G. Jung, but C.G. Jung. So this is my little editorial soapbox here to mention. You can refer to him as Jung or Carl Gustav Jung, C.G. Jung, but I would avoid calling him simply Carl Jung. That's over. Here's the quote. In order, there's two from, I'll give you one first, that's not there. In order to educate an individual to completeness, in order to educate an individual to completeness and independence, we need to bring to fruition all those functions which have been hitherto attained, but little conscious development of, or none at all. To educate an individual to completeness or to wholeness means that we must develop all those parts of ourselves that we possess but have not yet been educated and become conscious. And the other, in our time, it is the intellect making darkness. It's the intellect that's making darkness because we've let it take too big a place. Consciousness discriminates, judges, analyzes, and emphasizes the contradictions. It's necessary work up to a point, but analysis kills. synthesis brings to life. We must find out how to get everything back to connection with everything else. We must resist the vice of intellectualism and get it understood that we cannot only understand. And we're living in a time now where STEM it's based on increasing our human drive for certainty. It wants to increase our drive for control, as you see what happens as we try to dominate nature. But we're living in a time that Jung would say, we must understand that we cannot only understand. And this is essential for making one's way in the world today. So I want to move now to two comments that to bring to your attention. I want to point out to you that there's a special event, a webinar coming up on June 24th by our distinguished Professor Dr. Susan Rowland, who is the co-chair of our Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life degree program. And the June 22nd webinar is called Jungian Arts-Based Research, How Creative Practice Becomes a New Research Methodology with Depth Psychology. So if there's any point or idea or concept that may have struck you as interesting, in many ways, my presentation is meant to be kind of a pathway that might lead you to further movement in your consideration of Pacifica as the place for your graduate education. And I'll read the description here for you. Artists and creators have long lamented the split in culture between the knowledge-making sciences and the interpreting arts and humanities. Now in the 21st century, calling out for disciplinary solutions to epochal problems of climate change, too long denied social justice, Jungian arts-based research offers the reunification of the science of knowledge and of culture. This webinar will show how Jungian arts-based research brings back alchemy as a holistic, socially engaged cosmic vision. We will also discuss how this work is developed in Pacifica's unique program, Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life. So I highly recommend that if after this presentation and your full day of engaging in the different programs, you're interested in learning a little bit more about Noetic Education and Jungian arts-based research, that you attend to that. I also want to point out here something that is important to our overall presentation of our mission, and that is the Pacifica Online. Pacifica Online, our retreat center, involves a number of cutting-edge, very innovative programs that are meant to develop a sense of the way the world works in terms of how the unconscious and how dreams and how uncertainty and how the breaking of symmetry and predictability is an opportunity for creative, innovative living. And even so, tomorrow, for example, June 19th, we're having an international symposium entitled Accessing the Ineffable, Depth Psychology, Religious Experience, and the Further Reaches of Consciousness. Then on June 28th to August 13th, we have a certificate in applied mythology. Again, we've talked about the reading images, right? That Noetic Literacy is reading images in mythology, but reading images in advertising, reading it in television, reading the images and the communications therein in political statements or in debates. And so that happens on June 28th, 13th. On July 31st, September 4th, Archetypal Astrology and Personal Mythology, Part 1. And it focuses on elements in the zodiac. And in September 15th, 22nd, and 29th, different Wednesdays, there's again, the program Seeking the Duende and Claiming Our Mythic Stories. Duende, that powerful, strange, numinous energy of life and death, of creation and destruction. So these are the kinds of programming that supports and enlarge our degree programs. And it's something that whether you come to our degree programs now or in the future, you might want to engage Pacifica through its online programs, through the Retreat Center, through Pacifica Online. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'm hoping that maybe there are some questions. Jessica, has anything come in? Or...
Yes, so just a reminder that at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A box. So if you have any questions for our featured presenter, you can feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Looks like we're still waiting for people to type in some questions. I do see a general admissions question, so I can go ahead and answer that while we're waiting for others to type in their questions for the presentation. And again, it's right at the bottom of the screen. You can just type in anything at the Q&A box. So the admissions question that we have is it possible to begin the counseling program in the spring? So the majority of our programs have only fall enrollment, and that includes counseling, psychology. Counseling only accepts applications for the fall. The exception to that is our Jungian and Archetypal Studies program. That's an MA PhD, and then our MA in Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life. We do accept applications for those two programs for spring, but for those two programs as well, the next enrollment period is fall 2021, and then the next enrollment period for those two programs would be spring 22. Okay, so let's review our questions. So this program specifies especially for the PhD in clinical psych, but maybe Dr. Peter, you could answer it just generally. So the question is, with the understanding that the body, touch, and skin are integral in our human experience, how is somatics incorporated into a depth perspective? So that is our second question in the Q&A box.
Well, somatics is important to depth psychology because Jung pointed out that the psyche is basically a collection of images, and images exist in all the sensory domains. Many people think images are strictly visual, but the fact is that there are images in all of the senses. So for example, if you hear a sound, it often raises an image in the mind. It might be a memory, or you're in the kitchen and your olfactory senses of smell are activated. You think of your great-grandfather or your grandmother, or as a child in your mother's kitchen, or movement, dancing, or children playing on a bike. The movement of body in wind is a kind of analogic correspondence that creates images, even visual, sonic images. So that Jung pointed out that the psyche, being a kind of assemblage of images, also pointed out that the psyche itself has a physical component. Dr. Cambray, our president, of course, studies the extension of the psyche out into the world, into physicality. So the somatic is something that we had in the past as a particular program, but now we are revisioning and reconsidering how to embed the somatic in all of our programs as part of our depth psychological perspective. So rather than having it as one specialization, the challenge now for us is to move towards the integration and the wholeness of the programs that I've spoken about in a way that makes sure that everybody gets some sense of that experiential bodily kinesthetic part, not as only one degree program, but part of a general depth psychological approach that's in keeping with Jung's understanding of the psychoid nature of the archetype being as much material as it is psychic or spiritual.
Thank you for your answer. I am also seeing a few more admissions questions, so I'd like to kindly reroute those to our student services presentation, which will be at the end of the day. And we'll continue to answer the questions for Dr. Rojcewicz. Okay, here's another question. You included the inter and intrapersonal and wisdom of bodily presence in Noetic education. How do you do this with distance learning?
How do you do this with, what's the last part?
Distance learning.
Well, interpersonal and intrapersonal learning via distance learning is the challenge for sure, right? But it's a matter of, I think, framing. If an instructor in a distance education class is asking one to monitor one's internal life, monitoring your responses emotionally, intellectually to what is being talked about. Perhaps the topic is timely, and maybe even problematic or somewhat volatile. And part of the interpersonal dimension is being fostered by the instructor's framing to watch and monitor your responses so that you are aware if you are getting anxious, if it's triggering something, if it is bringing up a positive or negative memory. So that kind of intrapersonal understanding of how your inner life and how it may be projected outward onto relationships, or how you might project it into the Zoom classroom, how it may complicate the concord of your of the class that you're in, how it may help it, is a way of making sure that interpersonal and interpersonal knowledge is developed even that way. So it's a matter of framing and sensitivity on part of the instructor. And certain activities can occur in that class in order to make sure that that is not only accidental, but intentional.
Thank you. Our next question is, how would you describe a transcendent modality of knowing?
How would you describe a transcendent modality of knowing? Well, I think this is something that many people have all the time. In the literature of nature, mysticism, have you ever walked into the woods and it's as if there is a kind of healing with nature in mind? It's as if the robotic mind, the mad monkey of the mind, is somehow calmed by virtue of the natural situation. And that there are moments where the psyche will speak to us, that something will rise up into consciousness. And it often happens because, this moment of what Jung would call maybe the transcendent function, it's because walking into a situation, nature often disarms us. And we're living in a world today where we have to cope. We cope with change, cope with racism, cope with unemployment, cope with the volatility in the political world. But these moments of transcendent learning often come when we're in situations where we are copeless, not hopeless, but copeless, meaning rather than persevering and saying, I'll get through this, it's as if we are now open and vulnerable, even surrendered to what might emerge in the learning moment, what might emerge from the soul, what might emerge in our relationship with someone, because we are not trying to persevere, but we open up. And that kind of transcendent moment beyond the ego's fear of the need to have to bite down on the back of your molars produces insight, intuition.
Thank you for your answer. Let's take one more question. These are wonderful questions, and then we'll go ahead and have a short break, and then we will transition to our breakout sessions. So this is a great question. What advice would you offer to someone like myself who has felt bound by a sense of being a product of a rigid STEM discipline and wanting to understand and break through that and having breaking through in order to be creative and intuitive?
Well, first of all, I would say that having that STEM basis is a positive element because you're already looking to augment it, right? The idea again is not to offer the mind body less than the approach of objectivity, of rationality, and the calculative sense of the mind, but to add more to it. So because you're interested in wholeness, I think that commitment would be something that stimulates the psyche. Your commitment, your intention to your own wholeness could show up immediately in dreams and in intuitions that will move you in the direction. So the idea is that the psyche likes to have arrangements made. Make a deal with your psyche that you're committed to broadening out and developing an all-sided mind, become an all-sided person, and make a deal with your psyche that you will engage your education for the purpose of making sure that your instrument, mind, body, spirit, can realize its individuation, not only for your own benefit, but for what you can bring as the gift of your wholeness to yourself, to your family, to your friends, to the community. Because we need living, embodied examples of people who have struggled for their wholeness, who will dare to be inconvenienced by moving beyond what they know, but which is a constraining limitation on their wholeness, and yet will struggle to achieve something greater. And so I would say that make that deal with yourself. If you decide whether you come to Pacifica, which I hope you will, or seriously consider, or not, make that arrangement with your psyche. The psyche likes to have deals made, and it will show you a sign about what the next step is. So watch your dreams. If you're a painter, if you're an artist, watch what happens, but try to be hopeless. Try to be open to what emerges to you, rather than bemoaning the fact that your education, which is probably very good, has been one-sided so far.
Thank you so much. So with that word of advice, we'll end there. And again, we do hope you join us at Pacifica, and we're here to help.